The sun beat down mercilessly on the cobblestones outside Buckingham Palace that summer afternoon. Royal Guard Thompson wiped a tiny bead of sweat from his forehead, his last casual movement before assuming his post. As he stood there in his pristine uniform, complete with the iconic bearskin cap, tourists buzzed around him like excited bees, snapping photos and pointing in wonder at his perfectly still stance. Anyone who's visited Buckingham Palace knows these guards are a special sight. They're not just soldiers, they're living symbols of British tradition. And Thompson, he was one of the best. 15 years of service had taught him every trick in the book, how to ignore the aching in his feet during long shifts, how to keep his eyes focused ahead even when tourists waved their hands in his face, and most importantly, how to maintain that legendary stillness no matter what happened around him. The day started like any other. Groups of visitors from all over the world gathered around, their voices a mix of different languages and accents. Kids pointed excitedly, elderly couples took photos, and tour guides shared fascinating bits of history about the palace and its guards. Thompson could hear snippets of their conversations, someone wondering if the guards were really statues, another betting they could make him smile. A young girl in a bright yellow dress caught his eye as she tugged on her mother's sleeve, asking in a stage whisper, "Mommy, is he real?" Thompson kept his face straight, but inside he smiled. These innocent moments were what made his job special. He'd seen thousands of similar scenes over the years, each one reminding him why he took such pride in his role. The morning crowds had been particularly cheerful. A group of school children on a field trip had just finished singing "God Save the King," slightly off-key but full of enthusiasm, and several tourists had commented on how impressive the guards looked in their full ceremonial uniform despite the heat. Thompson had even overheard an elderly gentleman explaining to his grandchildren about the guards' training and dedication, filling him with quiet pride. As the afternoon wore on, the temperature continued to rise. Thompson could feel sweat rolling down his back beneath his heavy uniform, but his posture remained perfect. Years of training had taught him that maintaining dignity and composure wasn't just about following rules, it was about embodying the honor and tradition of centuries of service. Regular visitors to the palace would often notice how the guards seemed to have their own silent language, subtle nods, barely noticeable gestures that spoke volumes to their fellow guardsmen. Thompson had mastered this subtle art of communication, able to alert his colleagues to potential issues without ever breaking character. It was a skill that would prove invaluable in the moments to come. The crowd's mood began to shift slightly as the afternoon heat intensified. People grew a bit more restless, children became cranky, and tourists pushed closer to the barriers, seeking better photos. Thompson noticed his colleague at the next post adjusting his grip on his rifle, a sign they'd both recognized as preparation for a potentially challenging situation. Little did Thompson know that in just a few minutes, his years of training would be put to the ultimate test. As he scanned the crowd with practiced ease, he noticed a man moving differently from the other tourists. Where others were relaxed and curious, this individual's body language spoke of tension and aggression. Thompson's military instincts, honed through years of service, told him something was about to happen. The peaceful atmosphere of the tourist attraction was about to shatter, and Thompson would find himself at the center of an incident that would test not only his professional training, but his personal strength as well. The next few moments would transform an ordinary day of guard duty into something that would capture the world's attention and spark a conversation about respect, dignity, and the power of maintaining composure in the face of hatred. The shift in atmosphere was as sudden as a summer storm. The tourist from Dallas stood out immediately, not because of his bright Hawaiian shirt or his expensive camera, but because of the anger that seemed to radiate from him. While other visitors were busy taking cheerful selfies and admiring the palace architecture, this man's face was twisted with an unsettling intensity. At first, he blended in with the crowd, muttering under his breath while filming with his phone. Other tourists gave him curious glances, then began to edge away as his volume increased. A family from Japan quietly gathered their children and moved to the other side of the courtyard, sensing the growing tension in the air. The man's voice grew louder, his words becoming clearer and uglier. His phone was held high, recording everything as he began his tirade. The beautiful summer afternoon suddenly felt heavy with discomfort as other tourists realized what was happening. A group of schoolchildren on a field trip huddled closer to their teachers, their excited chatter dying down to worried whispers. Thompson remained motionless at his post, his eyes fixed forward, his posture perfect. To anyone watching, he might have been carved from stone. But beneath that ceremonial uniform, his heart was beating steadily, his training kicking in with each passing second. The weight of his bearskin cap, the pressure of his boots on the cobblestones, the familiar grip of his rifle. These sensations anchored him as the situation escalated. The tourist's behavior grew more erratic. He stepped closer to the barriers, his phone still recording as he shouted derogatory comments and slurs. The crowd's reaction was immediate. Gasps of shock, murmurs of disapproval, and looks of disgust spread through the gathered onlookers. A mother covered her young son's ears, hurriedly trying to shield him from the hateful words. What made the scene even more disturbing was the tourist's apparent desire to provoke a reaction. He waved his free hand wildly, stepped even closer to the barriers, and continued his verbal assault. His face grew red with effort as he tried to get a response from Thompson, who remained as still as the palace walls behind him. The other tourists' expressions changed from shock to outrage. An elderly gentleman in a tweed jacket shook his head in disgust, while a group of college students began filming the incident on their phones, their faces showing a mix of disbelief and anger. A tour guide quickly moved her group away from the scene, speaking quietly into her radio to alert security. The air crackled with tension as the man from Dallas took another step forward, now dangerously close to crossing the barrier. Other visitors began to call out, telling him to stop, to show respect, to leave the guard alone. Their voices created a chorus of disapproval, but the man seemed energized by the attention, his actions becoming even more aggressive. Through it all, Thompson maintained his composure. His eyes remained focused ahead, his posture unchanged. Years of training had prepared him for difficult situations, but this was different. This wasn't just about following protocol, it was about maintaining dignity in the face of pure hatred. Each second felt like an hour as he stood there, representing not just the guard, but something much larger, the triumph of professionalism over prejudice. The crowd continued to grow as more tourists were drawn to the commotion. Phones were raised, recording the scene from different angles. Some people looked scared, others angry, but most seemed united in their silent support of the guard, who stood so still and strong in the face of such ugly behavior. The incident was quickly becoming more than just a disturbance. It was turning into a moment that would soon capture the world's attention and spark important conversations about respect, dignity, and the power of maintaining composure in the face of hatred. Time seemed to slow down in the palace courtyard as Thompson stood at his post, facing one of the most challenging moments of his 15-year career. The weight of his ceremonial uniform felt heavier than usual under the summer sun, but his stance remained perfect. Not a muscle twitched, not a finger moved, as he demonstrated the legendary discipline that made the Queen's Guard famous worldwide. In his mind, Thompson recalled his first days of training. His instructor's words echoed clearly, "Your uniform represents centuries of tradition. Your stillness is your strength." Those words had never felt more true than in this moment. Each second of remaining motionless was a quiet victory, each moment of silence a powerful statement. The tourists' hateful words seemed to bounce off Thompson's immaculate uniform like rain off polished brass. While the man continued his verbal assault, Thompson's thoughts drifted to his family, his grandfather who had also served in the guard, his young daughter who proudly told her friends about her dad's important job at the palace. Their faces in his mind helped him maintain his composure. Nearby tourists watched in amazement as Thompson's professionalism transformed an ugly situation into something extraordinary. His stillness spoke volumes. Each moment of restraint demonstrated a quiet power that was more impressive than any physical response could have been. A young boy tugged on his father's sleeve and whispered, "Dad, look how brave he is." The afternoon sun cast Thompson's shadow long across the courtyard as he continued his duty. The only movement came from his chest rising and falling with steady breaths, so subtle it was barely noticeable. His eyes remained fixed forward, looking past the current chaos to the horizon beyond, just as he'd been trained to do. Some tourists had their phones out, recording the scene, but their focus had shifted. Instead of capturing the hateful display, they were documenting something far more powerful: the unwavering dignity of a man choosing peace over confrontation, strength over reaction. An elderly woman wiped tears from her eyes as she watched, clearly moved by Thompson's display of restraint. The air was thick with tension, but Thompson's stillness created a strange calm at the center of the storm. His composure started to affect the crowd around him. People began to stand taller, their own faces reflecting the dignity they witnessed. Even small children seemed to understand that they were watching something important unfold. Through it all, Thompson's mind stayed focused on his duty. He thought about the countless guards who had stood at this same spot over the centuries, facing their own challenges with the same quiet strength. His instructor had once told him that true power isn't in showing force, but in choosing not to use it when you could. The sweat trickled down Thompson's back beneath his uniform, but his face remained serene. Years of standing guard through rain, snow, and scorching heat had taught him that physical discomfort was temporary, but dignity was forever. Each passing moment of restraint felt like adding another brick to a wall of respect that was growing higher and stronger. As the situation continued, Thompson's stillness began to tell its own story. It spoke of training and discipline, yes, but more than that, it showed the power of choosing how to respond to hatred. His silence wasn't weakness, it was a demonstration of strength that resonated with everyone watching. In standing still, he stood for something much bigger than himself. The crowd had grown larger now, drawn not by the spectacle of conflict, but by the powerful display of dignity they witnessed. People from different countries, speaking different languages, all understood what they were seeing. A man choosing to fight hatred not with force, but with unshakable composure. Each minute that passed added weight to his silent statement, turning what could have been just another ugly incident into a powerful lesson about grace under pressure. What happened next would later be described as one of those rare moments when humanity shows its best face in response to its worst. It started with a simple action. An elderly British gentleman in a worn tweed jacket stepped forward, placing himself between the aggressive tourist and Thompson. He didn't say a word. He simply stood there, straight-backed and dignified, joining the guard in silent protest against hatred. The gentleman's quiet courage sparked something in the crowd. A young woman in a bright summer dress, who had been recording the incident on her phone, lowered her device and walked over to stand beside him. She crossed her arms and planted her feet firmly on the cobblestones, her expression calm but determined. Within seconds, a high school teacher from Canada joined them, then a family from India, their colorful traditional clothes adding to the growing human rainbow. Children, sensing the importance of the moment even if they didn't fully understand it, tugged their parents toward the line. A little boy in a Spider-Man t-shirt stood as tall as he could, trying to match Thompson's perfect posture. His mother, fighting back tears, kept her hand on his shoulder as they joined the impromptu barrier of humanity. The scene transformed rapidly. Tourists from every corner of the world, people who had been strangers just moments before, began linking arms. A group of college students on their gap year set aside their backpacks and joined the line. An amateur photographer from Tokyo carefully placed his expensive camera in its bag before taking his place. A tour guide who had been explaining the palace's history in French to her group now stood silent in solidarity, her visitors joining her without hesitation. The angry tourists' words began to lose their power as they bounced off this wall of unity. Each hateful phrase was met with a new person joining the line, like flowers blooming in response to thunder. A grandmother from Brazil, who couldn't speak English but understood exactly what was happening, started humming "All You Need Is Love" by the Beatles. The gentle tune spread through the crowd, a quiet counterpoint to the negativity. The diversity of the human chain was striking. People wearing crosses, hijabs, kippahs, and turbans stood shoulder to shoulder. Business suits mixed with tourist casual wear. Gray hair next to bright purple streaks, designer shoes beside well-worn sneakers, all differences forgotten in this spontaneous moment of solidarity. A group of schoolchildren on a field trip, who had been watching wide-eyed from the sidelines, began making hand-drawn signs with pens and pages torn from their notebooks. "Love greater than Haiti," read one in wobbly letters. "Rest peace for all," declared another, decorated with hearts and stars. Their teacher, rather than stopping them, helped them hold their signs high. The atmosphere had completely shifted. What had started as an ugly display of prejudice had transformed into something beautiful. People who had been taking selfies minutes before were now taking pictures of this remarkable scene. Hundreds of strangers united, standing together against hatred. Some were sharing water bottles in the summer heat, others offering sunscreen or sharing umbrellas for shade. Even the palace pigeons seemed to sense the change, peacefully gathering near the human chain as if joining the protest in their own way. The summer breeze carried snippets of different languages as people spoke softly to their new neighbors in line, sharing smiles and nods of understanding that transcended any language barrier. Throughout it all, Thompson maintained his ceremonial stance, but the energy of the crowd's support seemed to make his position even more powerful. His stillness was no longer a solo act of dignity. It had become the centerpiece of a larger demonstration of humanity's capacity for good. The abusive tourist's voice grew increasingly uncertain as he faced not just one silent guard, but a united front of global citizens standing together against hate. The sound of police sirens cut through the summer air, growing closer to Buckingham Palace. The Metropolitan Police had been alerted by multiple calls from concerned tourists, and their response was swift and professional. 2 police cars pulled up quietly at the palace gates, their blue lights reflecting off the historic walls. 4 officers emerged from their vehicles, their movements calm but purposeful. They'd been briefed about the situation during their approach and had already seen some of the viral videos that were spreading across social media like wildfire. The lead officer, a veteran with 20 years of experience, took in the scene with a practiced eye, the human chain of protesters, the still shouting tourist, and Thompson standing perfectly at attention. The police presence caused a ripple through the crowd. People began stepping aside, creating a path for the officers while maintaining their protective formation around Thompson. The tourist, still holding his phone and recording, didn't notice the officer's approach at first, too focused on his tirade. His face was red from shouting, his expensive camera swinging wildly from his neck. "Sir," the lead officer's voice cut through the chaos with calm authority. "I need you to step back and lower your voice." The tourist spun around, his expression changing from anger to surprise as he found himself face to face with British law enforcement. His phone was still recording, now capturing his own look of dawning realization. The officers moved with practiced efficiency, their actions firm but professional. As they began to explain his rights, the tourist's aggressive demeanor crumbled. His voice, which had been so loud moments before, suddenly became quiet as he tried to explain himself. But the evidence was overwhelming. Hundreds of phones had captured his actions, and dozens of witnesses were ready to give statements. What happened next drew quiet applause from the crowd. As the officers began to lead the tourist away, he dropped his phone. Instead of shattering on the cobblestones, it was caught by a quick-thinking teenager who had been part of the human chain. The young person handed it to an officer, demonstrating that even those who had faced his hatred would still show basic human decency. The crowd's reaction to the arrest was remarkable in its restraint. There was no cheering, no jeering, just a collective sigh of relief and scattered applause. A young couple from Australia, who had captured the whole incident on video, immediately approached the officers, offering their footage as evidence. Others followed suit, forming an orderly line to provide their contact information for witness statements. Through it all, Thompson maintained his post as steady as ever. If anything, his stance seemed even more dignified now. A small smile crossed the lead officer's face as he nodded respectfully toward the guard, one professional acknowledging another's exceptional conduct under pressure. The human chain began to dissolve naturally, but the connections formed during those tense moments didn't disappear. People exchanged contact information, shared their social media handles, and hugged their newfound friends. A street performer who had watched everything unfold began playing "What a Wonderful World" on his guitar, providing a perfect soundtrack to the moment. The police took statements with patience and thoroughness. They listened as people from different countries described what they'd witnessed, each account adding another piece to the legal puzzle. Many witnesses mentioned how Thompson's composure had inspired their own peaceful response, turning what could have been an ugly scene into a powerful moment of unity. As the tourist was escorted to the police car, his earlier bravado was gone. The gravity of his actions seemed to be sinking in as he saw himself through the eyes of the united crowd. His walk to the police car was met with silence, not the angry silence of before, but the quiet acknowledgement that justice was being served in the proper way. The power of social media turned a single incident at Buckingham Palace into a worldwide phenomenon within hours. The first video, posted by a tourist from New Zealand, reached 1 million views in just 40 minutes. By sunset in London, clips of Thompson's dignified stance and the crowd's peaceful response had been shared in every corner of the globe. News channels picked up the story as it spread like wildfire across the internet. Broadcasts in Tokyo showed Japanese tourists who had been present sharing their stories on morning shows. In Brazil, a grandmother who had been part of the human chain gave an emotional interview about how it felt to stand up against hatred. Australian breakfast television featured the couple who had provided their video evidence to the police. The comments sections of these videos, usually breeding grounds for negativity, transformed into spaces of hope and support. People shared their own stories of standing up against prejudice inspired by Thompson's composure. A teacher in Canada wrote about showing the video to her class, sparking a deep discussion about dignity and respect that moved several students to tears. Back in London, Thompson's fellow guards heard about the incident during their shift changes. In the privacy of their quarters, they expressed their pride in how their colleague had handled the situation. One veteran guard remembered facing similar challenges during his early years and noted how Thompson's response would become part of their training programs. The palace itself responded with characteristic dignity. A brief but powerful statement expressed support for Thompson and gratitude to the public for their intervention. The words "dignity in the face of prejudice" from the statement began trending worldwide, appearing on handmade signs in anti-racism rallies as far away as New Zealand and Argentina. By evening, artists had begun creating works inspired by the incident. A street artist in London stayed up all night to paint a beautiful mural showing the human chain of diverse people standing together. Digital artists from around the world shared their interpretations, many focusing on the powerful image of Thompson standing strong while surrounded by unity and support. Professional athletes and celebrities started sharing the video, adding their own messages of support. A famous footballer posted about how Thompson's restraint reminded him of times he'd faced similar challenges on the field. A well-known actress shared how the crowd's response had brought her to tears, showing humanity at its finest. The incident sparked important conversations in unexpected places. Business leaders discussed it in seminars about workplace dignity. Military trainers around the world pointed to Thompson's composure as an example of perfect discipline under pressure. School teachers incorporated the story into lessons about citizenship and standing up for what's right. Religious leaders from various faiths found common ground in discussing the incident. An imam in Dubai and a rabbi in Tel Aviv both used it as an example in their sermons about human dignity and unity. A Buddhist monk in Thailand wrote a meditation about finding strength in stillness, inspired by Thompson's stance. The tourist's video, which he had intended to use to spread hatred, instead became a powerful tool for education. Edited alongside clips taken by other witnesses, it was used in anti-bias training sessions and school assemblies. The contrast between his anger and Thompson's dignity became a compelling teaching moment about choosing how to respond to provocation. As night fell in London, the incident had become more than just a viral moment, it had turned into a movement. People began sharing their own standing guard photos, showing themselves standing tall against discrimination in their daily lives. The hashtag #StandLikeThompson started trending, with people worldwide sharing stories of choosing dignity over division, peace over prejudice. 3 months after the incident, the changes it sparked were still rippling through society like waves from a stone thrown into a pond. Thompson's promotion ceremony was attended by several of the tourists who had formed that spontaneous human chain. The elderly gentleman in the tweed jacket sat in the front row, beaming with pride, as if watching his own son being honored. The tourist from Dallas had gone through a remarkable transformation of his own. After facing legal consequences and worldwide criticism, he did something unexpected. He asked to meet Thompson to apologize in person. The meeting, which took place under careful supervision, became another powerful moment of human growth. The tourist's voice shook as he expressed his remorse, explaining how watching videos of his own behavior had forced him to confront deep-seated prejudices he hadn't even recognized in himself. Security measures around royal posts were thoughtfully enhanced, but not in the way many expected. Instead of adding barriers or restrictions, the changes focused on fostering positive interactions. New signs appeared explaining the history and tradition of the god, helping visitors understand the meaning behind the ceremony they were watching. The spot where the human chain had formed was marked with a small, elegant plaque that read, "On this site, humanity stood together." The incident became a regular part of military training, not just in Britain but worldwide. Instructors used the video to teach about maintaining composure under pressure, but the lessons went deeper than that. They discussed the power of dignified restraint and how one person's calm strength could inspire others to stand up for what's right. In schools across the globe, teachers found creative ways to include the story in their lessons. A primary school in London had students write letters to Thompson, sharing what they learned from his example. "You didn't fight back with anger," wrote one young student, "you fought back with bravery." These letters, displayed in the school hallway, moved parents to tears during the next parent-teacher evening. The group of tourists who had stood together that day kept in touch through a private social media group. They shared updates from their different corners of the world. The Brazilian grandmother who started a community unity project, the Japanese couple who gave talks about their experience at peace conferences, the Canadian teacher who organized diversity celebrations at her school. Their continued friendship became proof that bonds formed in moments of standing against hatred could last a lifetime. Thompson's own life changed in unexpected ways. While he maintained his usual humility, his example inspired a new generation of young people to consider careers in public service. Applications to join the Guard saw a noticeable increase, with many candidates citing the incident as their inspiration. During recruitment interviews, people spoke about wanting to display the same kind of dignity under pressure. The tourist's viral video found a new purpose in corporate training programs and community workshops. Diversity consultants used it to demonstrate how bystanders could safely intervene in discriminatory situations. The human chain became a model for peaceful resistance, showing how unity could overcome division without escalating conflict. Local tour guides added the story to their repertoire, but they told it with careful respect. They would pause at the spot where it happened and speak about how a moment of hatred was transformed into an enduring symbol of hope. Tourists would often fall silent at this point in the tour, many taking photos of the plaque and reflecting on its meaning. Perhaps the most meaningful change was the quietest one. Thompson noticed it during his regular shifts, the way visitors from different backgrounds would make eye contact with him, offering small nods of respect. Children would sometimes imitate his stance, but now their parents would explain to them not just about the tradition of the Guard, but about the importance of standing tall in the face of prejudice. 1 year later, during a ceremony marking the anniversary of the incident, Thompson stood at his post as usual. The sun shone down on his polished boots and crisp uniform just as it had that day. But now, mixed with the regular tourist photos and excited chatter, he could hear tour guides telling his story to new visitors. The tale had become part of the palace's living history, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful way to guard tradition is to stand silently but firmly for human dignity.